The Hindu Kush had swallowed 3 extraction teams in 4 months. The jagged peaks, shrouded in perpetual mist and carved by millennia of unforgiving winds, had become a graveyard for the most elite warriors America could field. Each failed mission left behind encrypted radio silence and families who would never know the truth. The Pentagon's Situation Room buzzed with frustrated tension as satellite imagery revealed nothing but endless ridges of granite and ice, each one capable of hiding 1,000 secrets. Colonel Marcus Brennan stared at the topographical display, his weathered fingers tracing impossible routes up vertical cliff faces. 16 Navy SEALs had vanished attempting to retrieve a downed CIA asset carrying intelligence that could prevent the next 9/11. Every conventional approach had failed. Every elite unit had met the mountain's brutal indifference with catastrophic losses. The asset's emergency beacon had gone silent 72 hours ago, deep in a valley so remote that even satellite coverage was sporadic. "Sir, there's one pilot willing to attempt insertion." The aide's voice carried skeptical undertones that everyone in the room recognized. They had heard similar claims from Apache pilots, Chinook crews, and Special Operations Aviation Regiment's finest. All had returned empty-handed or hadn't returned at all. The mountain demanded tribute in blood and machinery, accepting no compromises from those who dared challenge its sovereignty. Lieutenant Commander Kestrel Ghost Thorne stood outside the briefing room, her slight frame seeming almost fragile against the institutional gray walls. At 5'4", she looked more like a college student than a decorated combat veteran. Her auburn hair was pulled back in regulation style, revealing a face that bore no visible scars despite 7 years of flying the most dangerous missions the Navy could assign. The other pilots called her Ghost because she had an unsettling ability to appear and disappear from impossible situations without explanation. What they didn't know was that Kestrel had grown up in the Colorado Rockies, where her father, a Vietnam-era helicopter pilot, had taught her to read mountain weather like ancient scripture. She understood how granite faces created their own weather systems, how thermal updrafts could lift aircraft beyond their service ceilings, and most importantly, how silence could be the difference between life and death in thin air. Her logbook contained flights through conditions that would have grounded entire squadrons, each entry written in the precise handwriting of someone who measured success in millimeters rather than miles. The room fell silent when she entered. 16 hardened military professionals turned to study the young woman who claimed she could succeed where their elite units had failed. Some smirked, others frowned. All of them had seen confident pilots become statistics. The Hindu Kush didn't care about credentials or courage. It consumed both with equal appetite. The mountains had spoken their challenge. Now they would discover if Ghost could speak their language. Lieutenant Commander Kestrel Thorne accepted the manila folder containing topographical surveys that resembled a topographical nightmare more than any recognizable terrain. Each contour line represented elevation changes that would challenge even fixed-wing aircraft. Yet she was expected to thread a rotorcraft through valleys, where the slightest miscalculation would result in catastrophic impact against unforgiving stone. The insertion point lay 47 miles beyond the last confirmed GPS coordinates, in a region where magnetic anomalies rendered traditional navigation equipment unreliable at best. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this is a suicide mission." Captain Rodriguez, the air mission commander, didn't bother hiding his skepticism. He had watched too many promising careers end in classified casualty reports. The weather window closes in 6 hours. After that, winter storms make the entire region inaccessible until spring. His concern was genuine, born from experience rather than condescension, but Kestrel recognized the underlying assumption that she represented another inevitable failure. The briefing room's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across satellite photographs that revealed terrain features resembling abstract art more than navigable landscape. Kestrel studied each image with the methodical attention of a surgeon examining X-rays, noting wind patterns indicated by cloud formations, identifying potential landing zones that existed more in theory than reality. Her finger traced flight paths that others had dismissed as impossible, finding microscopic advantages in elevation changes and thermal currents. The SH-60 Seahawk won't have sufficient power-to-weight ratio at those altitudes, another officer interjected. Basic physics, Commander. The statement carried the patronizing tone typically reserved for junior officers who hadn't yet learned the difference between textbook knowledge and combat reality. Kestrel had encountered such attitudes throughout her career, each dismissal serving as fuel for the quiet determination that had carried her through situations where louder personalities had failed. She opened her tablet and displayed performance calculations that accounted for factors most pilots never considered: barometric pressure variations, rotor efficiency in thin air, fuel consumption rates adjusted for sustained high-altitude operations. Her numbers indicated success was possible within extremely narrow parameters that demanded precision beyond normal operational standards. The mathematics were unforgiving, allowing no margin for error or hesitation. One miscalculation would result in controlled flight into terrain, a euphemistic phrase that couldn't disguise the brutal reality of high-velocity impact. "I need a stripped-down bird," she said quietly, her voice carrying absolute certainty despite the incredulous stares surrounding her. "Remove everything non-essential. Extra ammunition, survival equipment, even the co-pilot's seat. Every pound matters at altitude." The request violated standard operating procedures that existed specifically to prevent the kind of risk-taking that killed experienced aviators. But standard procedures had already failed 16 times. Colonel Brennan studied her personnel file while she spoke, nodding commendations that read like fiction rather than military records. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, combat zones where she had repeatedly accomplished missions others deemed impossible. Her efficiency reports contained phrases like exceptional performance under extreme conditions and demonstrates unusual competence in high-stress environments. Yet doubts lingered because success often bred overconfidence, and overconfidence in mountains meant death. Outside, the Hindu Kush waited with patient malevolence, its peaks hidden in clouds that promised violence. The maintenance hangar echoed with metallic sounds as technicians stripped unnecessary equipment from the Seahawk helicopter, each removed component representing calculated risk balanced against operational necessity. Kestrel supervised the process with exacting attention to detail, ensuring that weight reduction didn't compromise flight safety beyond acceptable parameters. The aircraft began resembling a mechanical skeleton, its internal components exposed like anatomical structures in a medical textbook. Every bolt, wire, and system received scrutinous inspection because mechanical failure at altitude would provide no opportunity for emergency procedures. Chief Petty Officer Williams, a 20-year veteran of helicopter maintenance, shook his head while reviewing the modification list. "Ma'am, I've seen pilots request equipment removal before, but nothing this extreme. You're talking about operating beyond manufacturer specifications in conditions that would challenge a factory test pilot." His weathered hands gestured toward performance charts that indicated operational limits well below their intended mission parameters. The concern in his voice reflected professional experience rather than personal doubt. Kestrel nodded, understanding the implications better than anyone present. She had spent countless hours studying helicopter aerodynamics, not from textbooks but from necessity born of repeated exposure to situations where theoretical knowledge meant survival or death. Her personal library contained engineering manuals that most pilots never opened, each page marked with handwritten notes that reflected hard-earned lessons from combat operations. The upcoming mission would test every principle she had learned through academic study and combat application. "Chief, I need you to adjust the engine parameters for sustained high-altitude operations." she continued, referencing technical specifications that pushed the aircraft's power plant toward its absolute limits. Increase fuel flow rates and advance ignition timing. We'll sacrifice engine longevity for performance, but we only need it to work once. The modifications would void warranty coverage and potentially damage expensive components, but warranty concerns seemed irrelevant when measured against human lives trapped in impossible terrain. The helicopter's interior now resembled a cargo bay more than passenger compartment, with exposed structural elements visible where seats and panels had been removed. Weight reduction had achieved the necessary performance improvements, but at the cost of comfort and safety margins that military aviation considered non-negotiable. Kestrel would fly alone, without co-pilot assistance or backup systems that normally provided redundancy in critical situations. Solo operations violated regulations designed to prevent exactly this kind of risk-taking. Her flight suit bore patches from previous squadrons and deployments, each insignia representing successful completion of missions that had tested her abilities and resolve. The most prominent patch displayed her call sign, Ghost, in subdued lettering that somehow seemed more prominent than the colorful unit identifiers surrounding it. Fellow pilots had given her that name after she began returning from missions others couldn't complete, appearing from impossible situations with explanations that never quite satisfied official debriefings. Weather reports indicated deteriorating conditions with high winds and reduced visibility expected within hours. The insertion window was closing rapidly, leaving minimal time for final preparations and pre-flight procedures. Kestrel studied meteorological data with the intensity of an ancient priest reading sacred texts, understanding that weather would be her most dangerous enemy during the upcoming flight. Mountains created their own weather systems that could trap aircraft in conditions beyond their performance capabilities. The Hindu Kush had claimed 16 of America's finest warriors. Now it would discover whether Ghost could succeed where conventional tactics had failed. Pre-flight inspection revealed mechanical perfection, achieved through meticulous preparation and professional expertise. Every system responded to Kestrel's commands with precision that reflected countless hours of maintenance and modification performed under extreme time pressure. The Seahawk's engine spun up with authority that seemed to mock the thin air waiting at altitude, their turbines generating power that would soon be tested against gravitational forces and atmospheric conditions that had defeated previous attempts. The aircraft trembled with contained energy, like a thoroughbred racehorse awaiting release from starting gates. Radio communications crackled through her headset as control tower personnel coordinated final clearances and weather updates that grew increasingly pessimistic with each transmission. Wind speeds at target elevation had increased beyond normal operational parameters, while visibility continued deteriorating as storm systems moved through the region. The insertion window was collapsing faster than anticipated, leaving minimal margin for the complex navigation required to reach the extraction site. Ghost, be advised that weather conditions are approaching mission abort criteria. The tower controller's voice carried professional concern that couldn't quite mask personal anxiety. Recommend delaying until conditions improve. The suggestion made tactical sense from a risk management perspective, but strategic considerations demanded immediate action before the intelligence assets capture became inevitable. Delay would guarantee mission failure, while proceeding offered slight possibility of success despite overwhelming odds. Kestrel acknowledged the transmission while adjusting flight controls that responded with mechanical precision, despite the modifications that had pushed aircraft systems beyond manufacturer specifications. Her instruments displayed performance parameters that existed at the edge of acceptable limits, each gauge needle hovering near red lines that indicated maximum safe operating conditions. The helicopter lifted from the landing pad with authority that seemed to defy the laws of physics, its rotor blades biting into air molecules with aggressive efficiency. Ground personnel watched the departure with expressions that reflected professional respect mixed with personal concern, for a pilot they had learned to appreciate despite initial skepticism about her capabilities. Many had witnessed her previous missions, each one demonstrating competence that transcended gender stereotypes and preconceived notions about what constituted appropriate military leadership. Her success rate had converted doubters into supporters, though doubts remained about whether even her exceptional skills could overcome the Hindu Kush's legendary hostility toward aircraft operations. The flight path led directly toward mountain peaks that disappeared into cloud cover designed by nature to conceal the treacherous terrain ahead. Kestrel navigated using GPS coordinates that became increasingly unreliable as magnetic anomalies interfered with satellite signals, forcing reliance on traditional navigation methods that required constant attention to landmarks and compass headings. The valleys below contained no recognizable features, only endless variations of rock and ice that looked identical from altitude. Her radio maintained intermittent contact with base operations, though signal strength decreased rapidly as distance and terrain interference combined to isolate the aircraft from external support. Soon, she would be operating beyond communication range, alone with her aircraft and the mountain's legendary malevolence. The silence would be complete, broken only by engine noise and her own breathing through the oxygen system that kept her conscious at altitudes where unprotected humans would lose consciousness within minutes. The Hindu Kush stretched endlessly ahead, its peaks reaching toward gray skis like ancient spears thrown by forgotten gods. Ghost flew toward her destiny. Altitude readings climbed steadily as the Seahawk fought against increasingly thin air that provided less lift with each 1,000 feet gained. Engine performance remained within acceptable parameters despite operating well beyond normal service ceilings, testament to Chief Williams' modifications and Kestrel's precise flight technique that maximized every component's efficiency. The helicopter vibrated with mechanical stress that could be felt through flight controls, each tremor indicating systems pushed toward their absolute limits by demands that manufacturer specifications never anticipated. Mountain peaks emerged from cloud cover like massive monuments to geological violence, their granite faces scarred by millennia of wind and ice that had carved features resembling abstract sculpture more than recognizable terrain. Navigation became increasingly challenging as GPS signals degraded beyond reliable accuracy, forcing reliance on dead reckoning calculations that demanded constant attention to compass headings and elapsed time intervals. One navigational error would send the aircraft into terrain that offered no possibility of survival. Base, Ghost Actual, passing flight level 12,000, maintaining course 047 degrees magnetic. Her transmission barely penetrated atmospheric interference that grew stronger with altitude and distance from base operations. Radio silence would soon become complete, cutting communication with external support that could provide weather updates or emergency assistance if mechanical problems developed. She would be operating entirely alone in hostile environment that had defeated every previous attempt at penetration. The first insertion site appeared below as a microscopic clearing surrounded by vertical rock walls that seemed designed to prevent aircraft access. Landing zone dimensions were marginal at best, requiring precision that allowed no room for error or hesitation during final approach procedures. Wind patterns created by surrounding peaks generated turbulence that buffeted the helicopter with unpredictable force, each gust threatening to push the aircraft beyond its performance envelope into unrecoverable flight conditions. Kestrel descended through air currents that felt like invisible hands grabbing at rotor blades, her collective and cyclic controls requiring constant adjustment to maintain stable flight path toward the landing zone. Power requirements increased dramatically as the helicopter entered ground effect disrupted by terrain features, forcing engines to work harder against atmospheric conditions that provided minimal assistance to rotor efficiency. Fuel consumption rates exceeded calculated projections, reducing available flight time for extraction operations. The landing zone rushed upward with alarming speed as she committed to final approach, her depth perception challenged by terrain features that provided few visual references for judging distance and closure rates. Rocks and debris created additional hazards that could damage tail rotor or main rotor systems if contacted during landing sequence. The margin for error had narrowed to millimeters, demanding performance perfection from both pilot and aircraft operating under conditions that challenged every system simultaneously. Touchdown occurred with mechanical precision that reflected years of training and combat experience, applied to circumstances that exceeded normal operational parameters. The Seahawk settled onto uneven terrain with delicate balance that could be disrupted by wind gusts or mechanical vibrations from engines maintaining flight-ready status. Kestrel kept collective controls positioned for immediate departure, while scanning surrounding terrain for threats that might emerge from concealment provided by broken ground and scattered boulders. The extraction site lay another 23 miles deeper into terrain that appeared even more challenging than the route already completed. Engine temperature gauges indicated systems operating at maximum sustainable levels, while fuel quantity displayed consumption rates that would require precise planning for successful mission completion. She had penetrated the mountain's outer defenses, but the most difficult phase lay ahead where others had disappeared. Radio silence consumed the cockpit like a living presence as Kestrel lifted off from the first insertion point, her aircraft climbing back toward altitude that would provide clearance over ridgelines that stretched endlessly toward the target coordinates. The GPS display flickered intermittently, providing unreliable position information that forced greater reliance on pilotage techniques learned during basic flight training, but rarely used in modern aviation operations, where satellite navigation had replaced traditional methods of aerial navigation. Terrain below took on increasingly hostile characteristics as the flight path led deeper into regions where human presence was measured in decades rather than years. Ancient rockslides had created debris fields that extended for miles across valley floors, while glacial action had carved vertical faces that rose thousands of feet without interruption. The landscape resembled photographs from other planets more than terrestrial geography, its features shaped by forces that operated on geological timescales indifferent to human concerns or military objectives. Wind patterns grew more complex as air masses interacted with terrain features that created their own weather systems independent of regional meteorological conditions. Kestrel found herself flying through turbulence that ranged from mild buffeting to violent updrafts and downdrafts that challenged her ability to maintain controlled flight. The helicopter responded sluggishly to control inputs at altitude, where thin air provided minimal bite for rotor blades already working at maximum efficiency to maintain lift. Fuel quantity had decreased to levels that demanded careful calculation of remaining flight time against distance to target and return requirements. The mission was becoming a mathematical exercise, where success depended on precise planning and flawless execution, with no margin for miscalculation or extended search patterns if the extraction site proved difficult to locate. Engine performance remained adequate but showed signs of stress that would become critical if operating parameters increased beyond current levels. A massive granite wall emerged from cloud cover directly ahead, its vertical face extending upward beyond visual limits into gray sky that provided no indication of peak elevation. Navigation calculations indicated the route required passage through a narrow valley that cut through the mountain's heart, but visual confirmation remained impossible until she committed to approach procedures that would place the aircraft within terrain that offered no escape options if conditions proved unnavigable. The valley entrance appeared as a shadow in the rock face, its dimensions uncertain until final approach revealed passage barely wide enough for rotor disc clearance on both sides. Kestrel reduced airspeed and began careful penetration into geological formation that resembled a cathedral more than natural terrain feature. The walls rose symmetrically on both sides, their surfaces polished smooth by ancient ice flows that had carved this passage through solid granite over thousands of years. Visibility within the valley was severely reduced by moisture that clung to rock surfaces and created fog banks that shifted unpredictably with air currents flowing through the confined space. Navigation became purely visual, as GPS signals were completely blocked by surrounding terrain, forcing reliance on dead reckoning that required constant attention to compass headings and elapsed time calculations. One wrong turn would lead into terrain that offered no recovery options. The passage seemed endless, stretching for miles through mountains interior where daylight filtered down from narrow opening high overhead. This was where previous aircraft had vanished, swallowed by terrain that permitted no mistakes and offered no forgiveness for mechanical failure or pilot error. The valley floor gradually widened as Kestrel navigated deeper into the mountain's heart, revealing an ancient riverbed carved by water that had long since found alternative routes toward distant seas. Polished stones created natural landing areas that seemed almost designed for aircraft operations, though their remote location meant no human had ever walked on surfaces that reflected filtered sunlight like scattered diamonds. The geological formations displayed layers of sediment that told stories of planetary history measured in millions of years, their colors ranging from deep red iron deposits to pale limestone that had formed beneath prehistoric oceans. Her fuel gauge indicated consumption rates that exceeded optimistic projections, forcing mental calculations that balanced remaining flight time against distance to target coordinates and reserve requirements for return journey. The mathematics were unforgiving, allowing minimal time for target acquisition and extraction procedures before fuel limitations would force departure regardless of mission success or failure. Engine temperature gauges remained within acceptable parameters, but showed steady increases that indicated sustained high-power operations were approaching thermal limits. A flash of reflected metal caught her attention through the morning mist that clung to valley walls like ethereal curtains. Wreckage lay scattered across several hundred yards of ancient riverbed, its twisted components barely recognizable as aircraft debris despite bright orange survival equipment that had deployed automatically during impact sequences. The crash site represented one of the previous extraction attempts, its crew now part of the mountain's grim collection of those who had challenged its authority and found themselves wanting. Kestrel circled the wreckage site while searching for signs of survivor activity, though rational analysis suggested that impact forces sufficient to scatter aircraft components across such distances would preclude human survival. Emergency locator beacon signals that should have provided rescue coordination were absent, their transmitters either destroyed during impact or rendered inoperative by terrain interference that blocked signal propagation beyond these natural barriers. The target coordinates lay another 8 miles deeper into terrain that appeared even more challenging than routes already navigated. Satellite imagery had provided topographical information, but actual terrain features exceeded projections in terms of complexity and navigational difficulty. Rock formations created natural barriers that channeled air currents into unpredictable patterns, while elevation changes produced thermal effects that influenced aircraft performance in ways that flight manuals never addressed. Radio static filled her headset with white noise that occasionally resolved into fragments of communication from base operations, though signal strength was insufficient for reliable transmission or reception. She was operating beyond all external support, along with aircraft systems that continued performing despite operating conditions that challenged every component simultaneously. The silence was profound, broken only by engine noise and her own breathing through oxygen systems that maintained consciousness at altitudes where unprotected humans would survive only minutes. Another debris field appeared ahead, its scattered components indicating more recent impact than the previous site. Survival equipment showed less weathering, suggesting crash occurrence within months rather than years. The pattern of wreckage distribution indicated high-speed impact with minimal controlled flight input, consistent with mechanical failure or pilot incapacitation during critical flight phases. Kestrel noted the location while continuing toward coordinates that represented her actual mission, objective, rather than these tragic reminders of previous failures. The valley began ascending gradually, its floor rising toward passes that would provide access to adjacent drainage systems, where intelligence assets waited for extraction that might never come. GPS signals stabilized temporarily as the aircraft gained altitude above valley walls that had been blocking satellite coverage, providing updated position information that confirmed navigation accuracy despite reliance on traditional pilotage techniques during extended terrain flight. The coordinates indicated target proximity within 2 miles, though terrain features suggested the final approach would require navigation through passes that existed barely above minimum helicopter performance altitudes. Fuel quantity demanded immediate target acquisition and extraction procedures, without extended search patterns or multiple approach attempts. The pass ahead resembled a natural gateway carved through granite peaks by geological forces that operated over geological timescales, its dimensions allowing helicopter passage, with minimal clearance margins that would demand precision flying techniques in turbulence created by terrain interaction with prevailing winds. Kestrel began climb procedures that pushed engine performance toward maximum available power settings, while monitoring temperature gauges that indicated thermal stress approaching critical levels. Emergency survival equipment lay scattered across a windswept plateau that opened beyond the mountain pass, its bright colors standing out against granite surfaces like flowers blooming in an unlikely garden. The gear appeared recently abandoned rather than crash deployed, suggesting survivors had reached this location under their own power before circumstances forced equipment abandonment. Fresh footprints in patches of accumulated snow indicated human activity within hours rather than days or weeks. A figure emerged from concealment behind boulder formations that provided natural protection from wind exposure, waving orange signal panels that identified friendly personnel requiring immediate extraction. The individual appeared to be maintaining mobility despite obvious exhaustion and possible injury, their movements suggesting trained military personnel rather than civilian casualties requiring medical evacuation. Communication attempts through survival radio frequencies produced only static, indicating equipment failure, or terrain interference that blocked transmission paths. Landing zone assessment revealed marginal conditions at best, with surface irregularities that could damage aircraft systems if contact occurred during touchdown procedures. Wind patterns created by surrounding peaks generated turbulence that buffeted the helicopter unpredictably, requiring constant control inputs to maintain stable approach path toward terrain that offered minimal safety margins for error or mechanical problems. Power requirements at altitude forced engines to operate at maximum sustainable output, while fuel consumption rates exceeded conservative planning projections. The survivor moved toward projected landing area while maintaining signal panel visibility, their actions indicating familiarity with helicopter extraction procedures, despite apparent physical stress from extended exposure to mountain conditions. Professional bearing suggested military background despite civilian clothing that might represent operational security requirements or equipment lost during evasion activities. The individual's condition appeared adequate for immediate evacuation, without requiring specialized medical equipment that had been removed to achieve necessary weight reductions. Kestrel committed to final approach, while engines maintained maximum power output against atmospheric conditions that provided minimal assistance to rotor efficiency. Collective and cyclic controls required constant adjustment to compensate for turbulence that threatened to push aircraft performance beyond recoverable flight parameters. The landing zone rushed upward with alarming closure rates, as she balanced power requirements against control authority in conditions that challenged every system simultaneously. Touchdown occurred with mechanical precision, despite surface irregularities that transmitted vibrations through aircraft structure, engines maintaining flight-ready status, while rotor systems continued generating lift necessary for immediate departure procedures. The survivor moved quickly toward aircraft doors, their actions indicating urgency driven by tactical considerations beyond weather or mechanical limitations affecting mission duration. The extraction point dissolved beneath rotor wash as Kestrel lifted off immediately after passenger boarding, her aircraft climbing rapidly toward altitude necessary for terrain clearance during return navigation through passes that would test remaining fuel quantity against distance requirements. Engine performance remained adequate despite sustained high-power operations, though temperature indicators suggested thermal stress was approaching limits that could force power reductions if operating conditions didn't improve substantially. The passengers secured in cargo area wore civilian clothing that couldn't conceal military bearing evident in posture and movement patterns characteristic of special operations personnel. Communication was impossible over engine noise and through flight helmets, but hand signals indicated physical condition adequate for sustained flight operations, without requiring medical attention that would complicate return procedures. The individual carried minimal personal equipment, suggesting rapid evacuation from compromised positions under circumstances that prevented normal extraction preparations. Return navigation began immediately as fuel quantity demanded direct routing toward base operations, without extended search patterns or alternative course headings that would increase consumption beyond available reserves. GPS signals remained intermittent due to terrain interference, forcing continued reliance on dead reckoning calculations that required constant attention to compass headings and elapsed time intervals. The margin for navigational error had narrowed to parameters that allowed no mistakes or course corrections that would extend flight duration. Weather conditions continued deteriorating as storm systems moved through the region with wind speeds that approached aircraft operating limitations, even at lower altitudes where air density provided better performance characteristics. The helicopter descended gradually, while maintaining maximum forward airspeed consistent with fuel conservation requirements and structural limitations imposed by turbulence that increased with altitude changes and terrain interaction effects. Mountain passes that had seemed challenging during inbound transit now appeared almost impossible under current atmospheric conditions, combined with fuel limitations that precluded multiple approach attempts or extended navigation procedures if primary routes proved unnavigable. Kestrel committed to passage through terrain that offered no alternative options, her aircraft penetrating valley systems where previous helicopters had disappeared without explanation or emergency transmissions. The granite walls seemed closer now, their surfaces rushing past with velocity that emphasized the narrow margin between successful navigation and catastrophic terrain impact. Rotor blade clearances were measured in feet rather than comfortable operational distances, each wind gust threatening to push aircraft into unforgiving stone that would end mission success and human lives with equal finality. Engine noise echoed from valley walls like acoustic signatures of previous failures that had met similar challenges with less favorable outcomes. Visibility improved gradually as the helicopter emerged from confined terrain into broader valleys, where atmospheric conditions provided better flight characteristics, despite continued turbulence from wind patterns interacting with complex topographical features. Fuel quantity indicated reserves adequate for mission completion if current consumption rates continued without increase, though margin for error remained minimal, and weather degradation could force higher power requirements that would exceed available reserves. Radio communications gradually improved as distance from terrain interference decreased and altitude allowed better signal propagation toward base operations, monitoring mission progress with professional concern that couldn't mask personal anxiety about aircraft operating beyond normal support capabilities. Status transmissions provided position updates that confirmed navigation accuracy, despite extended operations using traditional pilotage methods rather than satellite-dependent systems. Base, ghost actual, extraction successful, one passenger aboard, fuel state critical, requesting priority approach and emergency services standing by. Her transmission carried professional composure despite circumstances that had tested aircraft and pilot capabilities beyond normal operational parameters. The response indicated full understanding of situation criticality and preparations for immediate post-flight procedures that would determine mission success measurement and aircraft serviceability for future operations. The landing approach revealed ground personnel positioned for immediate passenger transfer and aircraft servicing procedures that would begin before engines reached complete shutdown. Medical personnel stood ready despite passenger condition, reports indicating no immediate trauma requiring emergency intervention, their presence reflecting standard protocols for personnel recovered from hostile environments where comprehensive health assessment was mandatory regardless of apparent physical status. Touchdown occurred with mechanical precision that reflected pilot competence despite aircraft systems that had operated at performance limits throughout extended high-altitude operations in conditions that challenged every component simultaneously. Engine shutdown procedures followed standard checklists, while ground crews began immediate inspection of systems that had been pushed beyond normal operational parameters during mission completion that others had declared impossible. The passenger emerged from aircraft with movement patterns that confirmed military background despite civilian appearance, their debriefing scheduled for immediate commencement with intelligence personnel who had maintained standby status throughout mission duration. Personal equipment recovery indicated successful extraction of assets that had justified risk levels beyond normal operational acceptance, though complete mission assessment awaited detailed analysis of intelligence value obtained through procedures that had cost previous teams their lives. Chief Williams approached with maintenance status reports that would determine aircraft availability for future operations, his expression indicating professional satisfaction with modifications that had enabled mission success, despite theoretical limitations that suggested failure probability approaching certainty. Post-flight inspection revealed systems that had performed within design specifications, despite operating conditions that manufacturer specifications never anticipated encountering during normal service life. Weather reports confirmed that mission timing had been critical, with atmospheric conditions deteriorating beyond helicopter operational capabilities within hours of successful extraction completion. The insertion window had closed permanently until spring weather patterns allowed renewed access to terrain that would remain inaccessible through winter months, when storm systems made survival impossible even for military personnel equipped with specialized cold weather equipment. Colonel Brennan reviewed preliminary mission reports with satisfaction, tempered by awareness that success had been achieved through risk acceptance that violated normal operational procedures designed to prevent exactly this type of casualty-producing exposure to environmental hazards beyond human control. The extracted intelligence asset represented strategic value that justified tactical risks, though future operations would require alternative approaches that didn't depend on individual pilot capabilities operating beyond institutional support systems. Kestrel completed post-flight procedures with mechanical precision that reflected professional competence, despite physical and mental stress from extended operations under conditions that challenged every aspect of pilot training and aircraft performance simultaneously. Her flight suit showed evidence of perspiration and tension that couldn't be concealed despite professional composure, maintained throughout mission duration, that had tested personal limitations alongside mechanical systems, pushed toward absolute operating boundaries. The debriefing session revealed tactical information that would influence future operational planning, while confirming intelligence value that validated risk acceptance during mission authorization procedures. Technical data concerning aircraft performance at altitude provided engineering information valuable for future system modifications that might enable similar operations without requiring risk levels that had characterized this particular extraction mission. Recognition of mission success spread through base operations, with professional appreciation for competence demonstrated under circumstances that had defeated previous attempts using conventional tactics and standard operational procedures. Fellow pilots expressed grudging respect for achievements that transcended gender considerations and addressed capability assessments based purely on results obtained through skill application rather than preconceived notions about appropriate mission assignments. The Hindu Kush had finally yielded to human determination, backed by technical competence and courage, that refused to accept limitations imposed by terrain or atmospheric conditions. Ghost had earned her call sign through performance that would become legendary among military aviators who understood the difference between luck and skill when measured against mountains that showed no mercy for inadequate preparation or execution failures. The mission was complete, but its implications would influence operational doctrine for years to come, as military planners incorporated lessons learned from success achieved where failure had been predicted with mathematical certainty.